All right, Kevin, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you that are in the live audience today. It's great to be here. It's great to, follow probably what has been a multitude of wonderful speakers and good content. Um, Today's session's really talking about Microsoft Fabric and Microsoft Dynamics, and certainly, before we get into that, thank you very much for the Data Weekender team for giving this platform to share a little bit of information and experience that I've had the good fortune to collect in both my day job and over the course of my career. So, just a little bit about me. Again, my name is Trey Johnson. I'm actually based in St. Augustine, Florida, in the United States, not too terribly far away from James, as I mentioned just a moment ago. My title by day is a solution specialist with a Microsoft Dynamics partner in the United States called Velocio. My specific focus is around data and analytics and AI. And I've had really the good fortune of being a data and analytics practitioner on the Microsoft platform for greater than 30 years. So, in the kind of off hours and when I find time, I do produce some content and other things through another vehicle called No Labs. Um, but the result of my day job is I literally interact with hundreds of Velocio's customers every year that are using predominantly Microsoft Dynamics 365 ERP or CRM products that are really looking to do more with their data platform. We really call that the data journey, kind of helping people, kind of through that path and through that process. But the stuff that I do for fun is I like to get away from the keyboard, get away from the screens, and restore classic cars and boats. And most of the time it works out. Although a handful of months ago, the top car on the top left managed to spontaneously combust at a stoplight, and so that is now back in the restoration process. But as far as today goes, from an agenda standpoint, um, thought it might be helpful to kind of talk about the challenges that I most often am seeing interacting, with Dynamics customers. Likely some of those will resonate with you. Talk a little bit about, kind of the reference aspects, architecturally, fabric, dynamics, the things that you're doing, in terms of workloads there. We'll certainly kind of paint the picture of the different ways that data can be accessed in Dynamics 365 Business Central, finance and operations, or you may call it finance and supply chain management, and CE, or more generically, what was CRM. And then we'll talk about some other pattern sort of stuff. We'll wrap up our time here today, and hopefully there'll be kind of a sense of new information for many of you. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges side of what I've been seeing interacting with customers that are leveraging Microsoft Dynamics and really kind of struggling, a little bit, with the tooling. And apparently, font got a little bit off on this slide, so I'll just kind of talk through it. The things that we encounter often is, if a company has been on Microsoft Dynamics in terms of the legacy products, that is AX, NAV, um, probably not so much from GP for the rest of the world, but certainly in the United States and SL. Those products, people were using a variety of different ISV tools, to get to data, to bring the data together, support, the very basic analytics, basic reporting, things of that nature. What we find is there's still a continuance of those tools or the mentality that they need to kind of hang on to those tools, versus potentially switching over to Fabric and other, kind of more modern technologies. One of the bigger challenges, though, is, and I think that this kind of comes a little bit out of James' topic just a few minutes ago, is there's oftentimes a struggle with where data lives. So the ERP data, a lot of times organizations have built up solutions just simply around the ERP, but as they try and bridge across to other sources of data, they naturally kind of have some challenges there as well. And certainly maybe not so much the group on this call, but in a lot of cases there's some poor person or people that are just slaving away in Excel, trying to figure out how to do extracts from all the different systems. I think I heard the comment in the chat, Excel hell. Absolutely. That's a good picture of it. But there's also other factors beyond just simply the technology. And some of you may be in the case that you're kind of that lone wolf, within your organization that's really the most knowledgeable resource around where data lives. That dependency on one person obviously has some really strong implications, for the business. Furthermore, as some of you possibly are in organizations that are moving to a new Dynamics platform like D365 Business Central or D365 F&O or Supply Chain Management, moving from the predecessor or moving from something else into those new D365 applications means that you have to answer questions for the business that aren't just simply in the new system. If you've spent the last 10, 15 years on a different ERP, like one of the former Dynamics products, how do you actually answer the questions that say, where have we been in the last 4 years and where are we currently for the current year, across two systems? And so that's part of, kind of the challenges that we see. And then we oftentimes see, there's just a more acute awareness. I think that this group probably is a favorable spot. The data is becoming more important to businesses every day. And businesses are now really starting to discover that they can augment the data that they have, meaning it isn't just the ERP data, it's not just the CRM data, but it's actually the opportunity to take that data plus external sources of information, lots of credible public sources of information, lots of good industry sources of data. Shoot, we've got in the company I work for, we've got a few professional sports teams. They can use things like the weather and all kinds of other ancillary data feeds that are just very unique and meaningful, and in some cases challenges based on the tooling that they own. And so this is probably a crowd that's really receptive to the message that, everything gets a bit better with Fabric, because it absolutely does. And so the things that I want to really talk about is there's so many workloads that are, increasingly showing up within Microsoft Fabric. We could delve into a lot of areas, but the focus of this is very much on the things that you do to acquire data from an engineering and data factory standpoint, the ways that you present data in Power BI most obviously, and some facets around kind of the data warehouse workloads that are available within Fabric too. So if we talk to this in the most kind of basic picture that we can portray, we're seeing kind of the primary data sources on the left-hand side, pretty common format, common picture. Many of you probably have, some semblance of these data sources. And we're not ruling out entirely the legacy Microsoft Dynamics products. It's not something that's as much a focus, for this session, but just know that even if you're sitting there today and you're still on a legacy Microsoft Dynamics platform as one of your data sources, you can bring that data very easily into Fabric. And, really happy to go offline and talk about that. But what we're aspiring to do is obviously bring data centrally into the Fabric environment, support aspects of, kind of the medallion architecture, which, you can, James is very deep on that topic. As a person that has been practicing for just a number of decades, there's just some practical patterns there in terms of handling data, and it's kind of most raw form all the way through to the format that you want to present for the purposes of reporting. The interesting thing about this picture, the thing that I find interesting, is oftentimes when I'm talking to customers that have moved to Business Central or even to F&O as their ERP platform, they go, well, what's the SQL queries thing about? And what's really great for us, and for those of you that I think they're already there and practicing within Fabric know this, you can create the SQL endpoints or have the SQL endpoints where effectively you're mimicking, in a lot of ways, SQL Server, in the cloud. And what's great about that for specifically the ERP customers is they're used to that. They are used to having that access to the ERP, being able to run SQL queries against typically an on-prem or a cloud accessible database that obviously Microsoft had to take that away. They had to replace that with API-based interfaces mostly, because they needed guardrails around the application. It's not a favorable thing to be running a cloud-based infrastructure and people firing, Cartesian product type SQL queries, against an ERP and all of that sort of stuff. But once the data's in Fabric, we're kind of reintroducing the potential for using SQL. What that also does, as crazy as it sounds, and feel free to throw virtual tomatoes, but it also unlocks the ability to kind of leverage some of the older patterns of tools that they were using. So, for example, if an organization has some reporting services reports that they weren't entirely ready to get rid of, well, they don't have to entirely get rid of them just yet. They could continue to use it to report off the data that's within OneLake as part of the Fabric platform. So it's one of those things that's just really interesting, and it's one of those things that we kind of call out. Obviously, from a picture standpoint, we are aspiring to get the data into semantic models. The stuff that we do at my company, most often those semantic models really kind of mimic a domain. So sales or finance or purchasing or inventory management, so on and so forth. And that just makes it that much easier for users to either build the more visualized Power BI reports that look a lot like dashboards, all the way through like paginated reports, and occasionally supporting the scenario where people want to analyze in Excel. So you already had a good look at this if you were in the last session with James, so I'll just kind of flash it up there. It's a great graphic that really kind of talks to the totality of, kind of the modern data platform, and specifically kind of the data lakehouse, infrastructure. We'll leave it as is, just for people to, have it to look back upon if they choose to. But let's talk a little bit about accessing data in D365, and we'll start with Business Central. So there are, kind of a multitude of different ways that Fabric has introduced additional connectivity to Business Central. There's legacy kind of approaches, the first generation of data flows. OData is an interface that D365 Business Central supports, but we also have the ability to kind of leverage the more modern kind of data engineering tooling of Gen 2 and the data factory pipelines. And once we're working with pipelines, we can do stuff with Spark notebooks as well. And Power BI even has native connectivity to Business Central. All of those things are functionally good, potentially great, for getting started. The downside is they're, for the most part, entirely API reliant. What we have experienced at my own company, what I've personally experienced, is that organizations that are leveraging the APIs to extract data from BC at some point in time start to encounter some challenges around the volume of data that they're pulling through the API interface, the breadth of data that they're trying to pull in a single shot, the need to potentially create additional API interfaces to support other data that they want. And frankly, it becomes, kind of a pathway to aspects of technical debt. So I'm not completely disqualifying the things that you're seeing on the slide, because that wouldn't be really great for a session like this. But I will just say that there's other ways that this can be done. And the way that we really support this on a large scale across a number of our Business Central customers is actually through a thing that was originally created by Suma and Henri. It's the BC to ADLS, which stood for Business Central to Azure Data Lake Storage. It has been evolved by Bert Verbeek, who probably a lot of people on this call are familiar with him and his posts. Available in a GitHub distro that really is a nice extension to Business Central, and that's exactly what it is. So it deploys into the Business Central environment and basically allows for you to choose administratively, if you're a Business Central administrator, the tables that you want to replicate to the Azure Data Lake storage or to OneLake, the frequency with which you want to schedule those using the scheduler, within BC, and even the ability to kind of get down to, kind of various kind of cardinality elements like filtering columns and things of that nature. And so, just to paint a very small picture in the slides, this is if you've ever seen BC, you'd be really familiar with, kind of, oh, this looks exactly like one of the admin screens in BC. But the nice thing about it is it's just a place for us to capture the detail. In the business that I'm in personally, that means that we can actually empower people that aren't necessarily data practitioners, data engineers, folks that would really kind of drive these processes to be owners of the things that they want to choose, whether it be, the tables that they want to add, the fields that they want to choose from those tables. There's an ability to schedule that isn't necessarily on this particular screen, but those are all things that can be taught, to folks that maybe are not necessarily, kind of IT-based resources. And in our experience working with BC customers, there's a lot of organizations that are kind of low or no IT that are running Business Central. So this is a tool set that really kind of helps them. And just to kind of expand on what that is, so BC to ADLS, the tables again are selected in the UI for export in Fabric to OneLake. Via the job scheduler, we're basically choosing the tables that are run. The default format is CSV, and there's a Spark notebook that does conversion over to Parquet. And I think that is actually changing here pretty soon in one of the updates to the GitHub repo. So that's, obviously favorable. There's a quote from Bert, on the slide. He's just really been a pioneer at kind of picking up the torch and running with it. And a lot of kudos to Bert. He actually personally invested some time with the consulting practice at my organization, just answering questions, working through kind of the best practices there. If you haven't a chance to watch any of his videos, read any of his posts on LinkedIn, it's really, incredibly valuable stuff. So just in terms of another picture, so Business Central, Business Central has underlying databases, the transactional database. There's also effectively kind of a shadow copy that's there and available on Business Central. The extension basically is pulling from that, can pull in an incremental fashion, can basically queue those up for then whenever the scheduled run occurs. So we're not moving, the entire general ledger table every time over to Fabric, which would be incredibly costly. Sometimes you face that with some of the API interfaces where you're pulling larger volumes of data out. You don't have that with this. And what you also have is you have the ability to kind of schedule more frequently. So this can happen. We have some customers that are running some of their tables flowing over to Fabric, every 15 minutes. Which is fantastic for financial reporting type scenarios or scenarios that are tied to kind of period and closing, in an ERP context. But once it's within this environment, remember that it arrives as a CSV. We do a little post-processing, to convert it to Parquet files, and then those start to manifest as lakehouse tables that then can be presented directly to Power BI, or you can go through various medallion steps to get to the point where it's in Power BI. So that's one of the options. That's one of the solutions. If you're on Business Central, I would highly encourage you to look that up. So shifting gears just a little bit, we've got D365 Finance and Operations. And by its nature, D365 Finance and Operations is generally deployed in organizations that maybe are a little bit more technically complex, a little bit more involved in terms of, kind of multiple sub-companies and disciplines and business processes. There's a lot of those sorts of things that naturally happen, kind of a little bit functionally differently. As such, there's not necessarily native, connectivity. We can go through API interfaces again using Dataflow Gen 2, supporting, kind of the data factory pipelines, those sort of things. OData is essentially an interface that's available. There's some stuff from Gen 1 around the data flows that support this as well. What's really great for us, and maybe I'll go to the next slide, is there's a bit more choices and certainly architectural elements. Microsoft because of the nature of F&O being a little bit more enterprise oriented, has made a few more investments around the things that are available to support, kind of the ancillary kind of data platform, the ancillary kind of data analytics environment. And so we'll talk through, kind of some of those. But know as you look at these choices, or know as organizations has been faced with these choices, or maybe is facing them in the future, there's some common questions, so what are you looking to achieve, in terms of making data available to the business? If it's really solely focused around F&O, that's, kind of one set of solutions. If it's F&O combined with other sources of data, that's obviously a little bit different. But you need to, kind of balance are people going to be interacting with reports that are driven off the application? Is there, acceptable latency levels, around the data? And as I mentioned a moment ago, the blending as well. And so there's some different pieces. There's the entity store, BYOD, and the exportation as well. So the entity store is an in-application data store that's available within the D365 F&O, or supply chain management environment. It kind of mirrors, if anybody was on AX previously, and there was, kind of support for OLAP cubes, kind of mirrors that a little bit. Effectively, it is direct query from a contained environment. It is a replica. It is not a full replica of the entire schema. The entities that are there are optimized for reporting. The challenging parts is that it uses Power BI embedded services. It's not really available to external workspaces. It can't be persisted and PowerBI.com, that sort of stuff. The migration path, you've got to follow lifecycle services, which is much more of a in ERP kind of updates and upgrades, kind of life cycle. We have to conform with that, if we're going to promote a report or any aspect of what we're doing with Power BI there. It obviously has some challenges, in terms of kind of integrating with, other applications or external data. And, if you are contemplating using this, we've seen this in a couple of customers in the past, and I would just, I would vehemently argue against. Don't create custom entities in the ERP that you're going to feed data into to make this in application reporting better, because all you're doing is just bloating the ERP. You're just introducing data that really you should probably have an external data strategy rather than trying to bring the data into the ERP itself. So, but that is one of the options. Some of you maybe have faced that in the past. We have moved away from it almost entirely. There's probably only a few scenarios where it still is used, and typically it's when it's a very time sensitive kind of analytic requirement that we can support, kind of that direct query model within the application, within that instance, to support the user experience related to the business process that's happening within the ERP. So a second one is, and again, the font's got a little crazy, I guess, as I apply the template here, but is the bring your own database. And so some of you may have done that. It has been a very popular kind of pattern for people. Bring your own database, for those that are not familiar, it's just a model where you can leverage an Azure SQL database and set up replication of individual entities, to that. So you configure the export of the entities. Last I counted, there were 1,700 plus entities underneath the D365 F&O. So it's potentially a cumbersome experience. You do have to relabel to put friendly metadata or friendly column names, on the tables themselves, or create view semantic, or something along those lines, or support it solely in your semantic model. The challenge is, as you can see, kind of on the graphic on the right hand side, it is a very administratively heavy exercise. So you have to actually go in and kind of choose, the initial setup steps, But then, you're kind of going through the steps again and again, for each one of the tables that you want to support exporting, or each one of the entities that you want to support exporting to that BYOD environment. No shame if that's what people have been doing, because it really was, kind of the only option for a number of years. And then Microsoft kind of brought forward, additional options as the data lake became more mainstream. And so one of those options is export to data lake. And if you are still on export to data lake by the current day and time, you've got about 24 days left before it goes away. It's really funny to me because I've been talking about this, for some time. And when I was talking about this 6 months ago, the November 1st deadline was looming very heavily, and Microsoft chose to extend it. I am absolutely certain they are not going to extend it again. So it is absolutely going away in terms of the export to data lake. Feel free to clap for that, because it's really kind of a heavy lift, in terms of the technology and the process and the latency and all of those different kind of pieces. And as you can see on the screen, there's an export data lake service. The data is being copied out along with the metadata. We have to use CDM util to kind of do different things. And the original diagram references kind of Azure Synapse. There's a evolve diagram that's talking about Synapse serverless. Those things are all fine and good, but the export to data lake is just not particularly fantastic in any regard. Now the good news is Microsoft obviously has provided a means to replace that, and it's called Synapse Link. And Synapse Link, if you're not familiar, is a really good option for replicating data from your F&O or finance and supply chain management environment to really support the things that you want to do in terms of replicated data and data being available, through that fabric infrastructure. And so it's definitely going to be very similar to the export to data lake. There may be some minor kind of table naming differences that we've seen just a little bit. You are likely to see a reduction in things like operational costs, because the processing side is just far, far less. So if you were running up an Azure bill under export to data lake, you should expect a little bit of relief commercially from the processing that you do there. And so that's really good, but it's certainly not all. And so the other thing is OneLake really gives us a lot of options, and some of you probably attended sessions that kind of helped get across what some of those options were. Firstly, there's just the concept of shortcuts. So this is a slight departure from just purely the Dynamics content, but if you've made investments, where you've got data in Databricks, you've got data in Snowflake as another platform, you've got some data in Azure Data Lake storage that you don't necessarily want to completely port over to Fabric. Shortcuts are fantastic for that. It's a no copy option. Equally, you can do the mirroring from different data sources. The mirroring from those data sources just works. So if you've done mirroring from any of the other data sources, I had a chance not too long ago to support kind of a proof of concept around doing that with Snowflake, and boy, it just works. It was fantastic, and it was very easy to move past that kind of part of the technical solution stack and focus on the more meaningful things that we wanted to do with data versus plumbing. So, which is really good, and it certainly is kind of foundational for kind of this next piece, which is talking about Dataverse. And so, before we talked about export to data lake, we talked about the data export service from CRM. I haven't really mentioned much about CRM, so props for those folks that are on CRM as a platform. But the data export service for CRM and the export to data lake, boy, what a cluster, right? Just so much, kind of activities, data moving around, having to monitor and manage quite a bit. It probably felt very kind of debt filled from a technical standpoint. And so what we really have is we have, much better option with Dataverse. So you saw it, maybe a little bit glimpse of it a moment ago, but essentially we have D365 finance and operations through the Synapse link, essentially delivering data through Dataverse to the Fabric environment. You also have the capability of leveraging, the CRM platform of customer engagement and Power Apps, which uses Dataverse natively as its kind of data backbone, as a means of kind of simplifying the flow of data using Synapse Link, using the shortcut paradigm of OneLake. It just makes it that much easier. And Microsoft has kindly recently dropped a slide that I picked up that's maybe a nice picture. It's probably one that maybe more easily kind of conveys what's going on. We have the Dataverse, data, be it from CE, be it from Power Apps, be it delivered via Synapse Link. We can, leverage the shortcuts of Fabric. We can obviously do some things that, beyond the lakehouse and the warehouse model of creating views. So again, we're not really doing a lot of copying of data necessarily. We can then, once we get it to the state that we want, we can copy it into kind of final curated tables. If we're looking at this as somewhat of a medallion architecture, those gold tables support, kind of the direct lake aspects of the semantic model. If you're not familiar with it, direct lake is just a successor to kind of some of the direct query experiences, highly optimized for data living in OneLake. But more so, as you can see on this particular slide, it becomes the platform for presenting data out to the business. And semantic models, if you haven't invested the time in semantic models, please consider doing so, because what we have found is the old school approach of building the data set, kind of per Power BI report, limited the number of people that could actually build Power BI reports. But once you have a really kind of fully fleshed out semantic model that is reflective of the organization you're supporting, is reflective of the language that they understand, is just easily navigable because it's not the entire ERP, but it's a subset. All of a sudden, more people are able to build reports, people that wear analyst hats that maybe were really astute at doing things in Excel. They can now, do much more with Power BI because they don't have to necessarily understand where the data lives and where it comes from and build the data sets and those sort of things. So it's probably a little bit of me being on a soapbox there for a moment, but just know that it's an important kind of facet of what people do. And the Dataverse, the support for shortcuts, again, is pervasive, across the CE platform, which, by the way, is customer service and sales and field service, the finance and supply chain, or finance and ops, and Power Apps. The only D365 piece that's kind of left out in the cold at the moment is Business Central. I've gotten asked the question several times: is Business Central going to be promoting data to the Dataverse at some point? Logic says that they will at some point. Until then, I would really highly encourage the BC to ADLS piece, because that is really a strong component. It's just so much easier than the technical debt that you will building your own kind of individual pipelines, pulling data from the APIs, or worse, Power BI, kind of going up against the APIs. The other thing that is incredibly nice is, and it really probably was more reflection from, from this slide, is this paradigm really allows for data to move incredibly fast from those source applications, being, CRM, being D365 F&O, into kind of the OneLake environment. We're talking latency like less than 5 minutes, which is just incredible, because it really kind of opens the door that got slammed shut when people originally moved to the cloud. Because when originally they had a database that was running in their environment, and they could access and they could query and they could define what the latency was of the data. Once it got promoted to the cloud, again, those card rails went up. there were just kind of multiple gates that we had to pass through. So Microsoft is doing a really good job with the Dataverse and kind of the corresponding pieces around shortcuts to make that kind of time scale much more approachable. And we're really excited about it because our customers have had kind of longstanding requests for that type of delivery of information. So the bronze architecture, sorry, the medallion architecture, the medals on this are exactly out of order, which I always think is fun. But we're obviously talking about bronze, silver, and gold. I think that you got a fair amount of that from James previously. But just to talk to a couple of perspectives or elements about it, just real quickly here. We do bronze, and we really favor leveraging bronze if you are persisting ERP data or CRM data, because it is that preservation of the data in its most original form. I'll talk to why that's of value in just a moment. Obviously there's support for kind of the compliance and audits, and you can deal with the data in a variety of different ways. But also, in a lot of ways, it becomes very foundational for things like data science. So, of course, we want really pristine data often for data science type scenarios. But invariably, we also need to be able to kind of follow our hunches and do some of the very early data science activity just against the most raw data to understand, what's happening, what needs to be addressed, so on and so forth. If you're a newer practitioner, you maybe you understand that there's dimensional models out there. You understand dimensions and facts, but you haven't necessarily had a lot of resources that you would lean into. I have a book on my shelf that I still pull, here 20 plus years later, and it's the Data Warehouse Toolkit, and it just does a very good, plain job of explaining kind of how you structure data for purposes of consumption. It doesn't get into kind of all the marketing oriented stuff around mesh and fabric and so on and so forth, but in my experience, a lot of folks are not necessarily looking to try and persist, kind of what is the mainstream, architecture. They're trying to deliver something that works and is of value, to their business. And so a lot of times that means reverting back to things that were espoused a long time ago around the dimensional model. The Kimball Group, some of their materials are still online. If you don't know who they are, well, at least this is props to them and an opportunity to say that they were strong influencers. They've allowed me to have a really good career, and and I think their material certainly kind of supports a lot of that. So when we talk about the silver layer, we're doing some things like cleansing the data. We're moving it from that kind of transactional context into a context that's going to be more meaningful for analyses and reporting. We're doing a lot of things that naturally are just trying to kind of drive things forward. And Kevin, right on. It is a good book. Yeah, exactly right. You want to be suitably caffeinated for some of the passages, that's for sure. The silver layer, the opportunity to do some things, work towards some standardization. Maybe you've got multiple sources. You're really trying to pull together more composite of defining who the customer is. I always use customer as a great example of why we pull data together in a fabric environment. So, for example, CRM, if I look at customer purely from a CRM perspective, I've got a salesperson who's like, my customer is fantastic. They place an order with me every month. They're just wonderful. They're easy to engage with, so on and so forth. That's the customer perspective out of CRM. But once you start to bolt on the ERP perspective, all of a sudden you start to see some different things. It's like, yeah, they place an order every month, but man, it takes them 90 days to pay their bills, right? And that's only something that would come from the ERP. So you have a salesperson who thinks they're wonderful. You probably have a financial organization that's like, God, they could be better. They could pay their bills in a more timely fashion. And then you may even have like support organizations that are like, oh, that's nothing. They call us, every week with a different support inquiry because, their people are always transitioning in and out of the organization. It isn't until we start to bring all that data together that we understand, kind of the nature of like a relationship with a customer, and the silver layer starts to bring that together for us, gives us that kind of consolidated, customer entity. There's probably plenty of other examples as well. We are doing some things obviously to make sure the data is in the right shape, doing some validation. There's always a garbage in, garbage out, kind of approach that can be taken. I personally am, kind of along the lines of validate, articulate back to the business if the data isn't exactly what it needs to be. Let them go off and fix the business processes. I would highly discourage correcting or masking data, and then just simply reporting on it, because you're not doing anybody any favors, because eventually those bad practices for captured data in the process become worse. Those worsening processes then create some real confusion around the data, and all of a sudden makes the data platform you build feel incredibly suspect to the users. So one of the big things that we do in the silver layer, and I think that this is very prominent in the D365 world, is many of you are possibly employees of organizations that are growing or work with organizations that are growing. And so you've moved into D365, that is your chosen ERP platform or CRM platform. And then within 90 days, they acquire somebody else. And all of a sudden, new applications are joining the party. A secondary CRM platform like Salesforce or HubSpot, and additional ERPs that came from acquired companies, like NetSuite or Sage or QuickBooks, or gosh, there's just so many. If you haven't started to kind of really work towards what is the model for my organization, it becomes a lot harder to say, how do I make QuickBooks data look like D365 F&O data so that I can report on it? You can't. It's like really impossible. But what you can do is you can take an ERP, D365 as an example, and you can distill it into a much more simplified model for the purposes of reporting that you need to. Every ERP has a general ledger. They all have financial dimensions. Obviously, date and fiscal periods are, important. Those are all things that can kind of manifest in their own model, that are probably a little bit independent of the way the data is presented in D365 F&O or in Business Central, or would be presented in the newly arriving ERPs that you need to somehow kind of magically blend in. And I think we've all been on the receiving end of the, hey, we're acquiring this company in 2 weeks time, and within 8 weeks we need to be able to report across all of our companies. That's a real bear to try and absorb if you haven't really kind of put some thoughts into what you're doing around the medallion architecture. So just moving forward and probably closing out here relatively quickly, there's other cool things that we can do that are transformative. First and foremost, there's oh, cool. So we'll get to that in a moment. But first and foremost, there's time travel. If you haven't experienced the time travel facilities that are native to OneLake, they are ultra cool. What that means is that you can actually get what the data looked like as a snapshot going back 30 days, any time within the last 30 days. The only requirement is the schema cannot have changed. So if you added a column or did something like that, that's going to break, that kind of mold for doing the time travel piece. Semantically, it's very easy to accomplish. There's an example in the slides. So, there's plenty of examples actually online as well to support this. And if you're thinking about, okay, well, how would I apply time travel to maybe the ERP scenarios or the CRM scenarios? One of those is, we may take accumulating snapshots of inventory data. Time travel gives us a great ability to kind of do that or catch up on it if we miss a cycle. Same with things like production levels or AR balances. And on the CRM side, no salesperson has ever kind of changed, the estimated close date of their opportunity right before they meet their boss. So that kind of ability to kind of do that, are people kicking the can down the road that are salespeople, you have the ability to report on that a lot more easily. So probably a lot more that we could kind of get into and discuss, just briefly touch on some gold medallion stuff. First and foremost, go to dataonwheels.com. Really good contributor, long-term contributor here in the States, a gentleman named Steve Hughes. He's currently battling ALS. I was very fortunate to go to one of his sessions, one of his last sessions here, and he does a great job of talking through kind of the management of the OneLake environment, what goes into lake houses, what goes into data warehouses. It's just well worth your time, to look at that. There's plenty of opportunities to potentially learn more. These will be links that I'll try and post into the chat as well. I do greatly thank everybody for your time today. I know it's kind of the end of the day. I'll revert back to my slide in a moment, but I had the good fortune of following so many of these speakers. I hope you had the chance to listen to many of them or having a chance to experience their content. Just know that as these folks give their time, the best way to kind of give back to them, follow them on LinkedIn or connect with them on LinkedIn as they post, promote their stuff, all of those good things. It just naturally allows for, you as community members to really kind of convey the value that you think that these people bring. And if I happen to be one of those people that have brought you a little bit of value, feel free to, reach out to me via email. My socials are predominantly at Trey Johnson. So you can find me on LinkedIn and other places. But I really gratefully appreciate, the time to spend with all of you today, and certainly hope to see folks at the next Data Weekender.
Thank you so much, Trey. That's a great session. And if anybody have any questions, please feel free to post it in the chat window. I'm checking that. And yeah, please also provide the feedback if you like the session. And hey, Kevin, I see you.
Yeah, I was just going to say to everybody, those that are staying on for a bit, I will return very shortly. Just give me 2 minutes. Trey, fantastic session. If anyone's got any questions for Trey, then obviously put them in the chat now while Stevie's here, and I shall return very shortly for everybody to do the post-event wrap-up and a few other things like I put in the chat just now, okay? So give me a moment.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I'm not seeing any questions.
Well, this might be the first time I've done this where there haven't been questions. So either I'm getting better at telling people about it, or I've gotten more confusing. I'm not sure which. So.
No, it's a long day for everyone. So
of course,
maybe
of course.
they're tired and like overwhelmed with all the information that I have to sink in.
Yeah, so Marisol has posted a good question. It's a tip for finding out the relationships between tables in D365 F&O. You're absolutely right. There is no official overview. Oh goodness, I thought somebody had mapped it out in a workbook. Excel-based workbook, so you could kind of filter. But I may be confusing that with BC. Feel free to, Marisol, hit me up on one of my emails, and I'll be happy to go kind of look and see. I don't remember off the top of my head where that was, but it's a very good question.
Awesome. Any more questions?
Well, I have a question for the group, and they can either use the React or whatever. But if folks had a good day, if they gotten a good fill of information, and most importantly, is it stuff you can use in your job?
Thumbs up.
There we go. We got a thumbs up. All right, Adrian. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Oh, there's Marisol. Very good. Legal limitations for synapse links, or the other one around D365 custom entities. No, I don't believe so. I think that's Owen Miller asked that. I don't believe that there's any issues with that. I think the Synapse link for F&O is exposing the schema, and the Dataverse. Basically, if it's in CE, it's going to the Dataverse. The main things to consider around the Dataverse, and I'm not like super expert on this because it's more about application settings and CRM. you do want to figure out how long you persist the data in the Dataverse. Um, I think many folks know that commercially, OneLake storage is pretty cheap. In the United States, it's like $26 a terabyte per month. If you go past your limits on Dataverse storage, I think it's like $40 a gigabyte per month. So you just have to be kind of a little bit cautious about what is persisted into that Dataverse data. So, and Harry, thanks for the feedback. Really appreciate it, mate. I look forward to, if anybody has questions to be on today, please use my email address, connect with me on LinkedIn. I posted that up just a few minutes ago. I'm always happy to, kind of continue to interact with folks. So appreciate that.